Okay. Welcome, book lovers. We are live at the Florida Book Fair, live here, right here on Facebook, and we're also over on Google Hangouts, so you can watch us in either place, and we'd be glad to have you. My guest this afternoon is Mark Alexander. Hi, Mark.
Alan, how are you? Hello, Lindsay.
Good.
Good afternoon.
And Lindsay Thompson is here, and we are just going to have a conversation this afternoon. And we want to learn a little bit about your book business, which sounds to me is a little different than most book businesses, and also learn a little bit about you and what, and then what you're bringing to the book fair. Where the book fair is coming up very, very quickly, and I hope you're packed. Well, almost.
Well, I just came back from a book fair, so I'm partially packed because of that. So
that's good. Well, Mark, how did you get into you deal primarily in poetry books? Is that right?
I do some modern literature, and I really started out more modern literature, and just for various reasons, I just kept selling more poetry and less fiction, and ended up being primarily a poetry dealer, and mostly 20th century. But I've sold, books from the 17th century on up, but mostly 20th century.
So how did you get in the book business to begin with?
Well, I had my real career was I worked for Random House. I was worked in sales and for Random House. I was the divisional director for the East Coast for a long time, and then for a few years out on the West Coast. And I left that job and about a little over a decade ago, and started be partially to do this. Never quite as lucrative as I would have hoped it would be, but lucrative enough, and a lot of fun, and mostly out of my house, book fairs, and most of my business is done through catalogs.
You live in essentially, I guess, suburban Durham, or are you further out from?
No, well, we're about 15 minutes from Durham, and we're in the same county as Chapel Hill. And Hillsborough is this. It's new to me. We moved here in July, but it's a lovely little historic town. About 8,000 people. A lot of famous authors live here: Annie Dillard and Alan Gurganus, Lee Smith, Frances Mays. I mean, it's really quite a number of famous people here in this little town, but we moved originally from Vermont. I grew up in Vermont and moved back there from California when I left Random House, and which is when I started my book business.
So okay, so you worked for Random House, and I guess so that means this book habit has been around for quite a while. Did you?
I still, Ellen, have the first book that I ever acquired. I was with my dad at an auction, and it was a book about the New York Yankees. It turned out to actually be a novel, the year the Yankees lost the pennant. But anyway, I still have that book, and but my dad was a collector. He doesn't care about poetry, never did, but he was a big collector of Civil War and genealogy and town histories, that kind of thing, of Vermont. And so I think it's in the genes, right? I have a brother who's a big collector. So
why do you think poetry has turned out to be your bestseller?
Well, boy, that's a tough one. Sometimes things just lead you in that direction. I happen to really like poetry. I probably in many ways like fiction better, but poetry, the history of poetry is really pretty fascinating. I mean, I really the different schools of poetry, the different isms of poetry, the modernists, the
Sure.
New York School of Poets, that kind of thing. Just it's a fascinating. They're fascinating in terms of the history of these groups and the individuals. I think for fiction, as much as I enjoy reading it, I just the books were done, frankly, in our generation. The books that were published were in such large quantities in many cases that there's way too many to meet the market and needs of the market. And with poetry, a big printing is 1,000 copies.
Sure.
So I think in some ways it makes it makes certain sense. On the other hand, when you go to a book fair and 1,000 people walk in, there might be 20 or 30 that have any interest in poetry. That's the downside.
Well, it's kind of, I mean, antiquarian books that we're dealing with are already a kind of a niche of a niche. So now you've taken it one or two more steps further, right?
Yeah, I tell people I really didn't want it to be too easy. Antiquarian books. As people in this business know, antiquarian books, it's really easy to sell an antiquarian book. I'm joking, so I just wanted to make it a little bit harder for myself.
That's right. If there's an easy path and a hard path, you're going to just take the one less traveled by.
That's
Is that
correct.
appropriate?
That's appropriate. Yes.
So what genres draw you? What speaks to you in poetry?
In poetry, well, I mean, speaking of Robert Frost, I guess I sort of grew up with Frost and really love him and have some terrific Frost titles.
And you would up there, wouldn't you?
and I would up there, although he's also Robert Frost was sort of famously wrote about Vermont and spent his winters in Key West. So
and had altercations with Hemingway.
Yes.
Or others, I guess.
Well, yeah, that was Stevens is the one who had, I think, a big fight with Hemingway. But
right.
Robert, but he spent a lot of time. He was sort of a rock star. He went to university places all over. There's a small school, I think in South Carolina. I can't remember where it is, but I believe he went there 23 times, and he did a lot of traveling around the country. But I really love Robert Frost. But I think the modernists, William Carlos Williams, is a very different kind of poet than Frost. But I love Williams too, and Stevens. And I grew up with in college reading Lowell and Randall Jarrell and Elizabeth Bishop. People like that, someone who no longer read much, and then a lot of the poets of my generation are beginning to sort of the ones that are just a little older than me that I really fell in love with as a younger reader. A lot of those people, Phil Levine and Phil Levine in particular, a lot of those people, but they're gone. And it's a whole generation that are slowly going away, and I've had a lot of a lot of their titles, and Galway Cannell, another Vermonter. So those are anyway, those are some of the poets that I really like, but a lot of them are going.
So one of the things that we often ask on our Rare Book Cafe broadcast on Saturdays is, what's on your nightstand? So what's on your nightstand?
Well, oddly enough, this being a town with all kinds of authors, about the same time as we moved here, an author that not many people know moved right next door. His name is Alan Apple. And so I was over there the other day, and I have a copy of his first book, which is called Time Again, I think it is. And it's a historical time travel novel from the 80s. So that's what I'm reading. But a fair amount of poetry. But that's the book I'm reading at the moment. I just finished a great book by what's her name? Well, I'll have to. anyway,
It'll come back to you.
it'll come back. I'm just
Yeah.
taking it back to the library now. I do use the library a great deal here. I never, working for Random House, I mostly read proofs and manuscripts, but now, on an antiquarian book dealer's budget, I primarily go to the library, but I do read a lot.
But it looks as if on your shelf there you have an extensive collection, and I guess nothing to be ashamed of.
Well, I have about 4,000 volumes. I have probably a couple hundred broadsides in there, but online I have around 4,000 books. If I have anything to be ashamed about, it's what most booksellers are ashamed about, is all the books we haven't processed. Some of which we may not get to it, and many of, I have to say, many of which are probably not worth getting to, but that's part of what we do. I am working on a poet by the name of Ted Ensslin from Maine, and I'm working on a rather large collection of his that I bought, and I have right at my feet, I have 3 boxes of things I need to get to, and they've all been cataloged. I just haven't tried to sell them yet. So there's a difference between cataloging and selling too.
I had a dealer tell me just the other day that if she spent more time cataloging instead of the other activities that she does, she probably would sell more books.
Well, that's true. Sure. Well, what's happening here is I'm trying to do a bibliography, and which really published was actually written by somebody else, Dr. Robert Bertolf, and I just trying to figure out a way to actually publish it. So I'm not sure anybody reads bibliographies anymore, but anyway, I think it's worth doing. So
it seems to me that it's never not worth doing if you're aggregating material that can be of use to someone. And
I agree. It's just I have a whole, you can't see them here, but I've got almost 1,000 bibliographies too, and there's a little room, a lot of which are in boxes, and I still use them, but it's amazing how inexpensive they are now compared to what they were even 20 years ago.
Right. And your bibliography is on what? What's the subject?
Well, again, I didn't write the bibliography that I'm trying to publish. It's on the poet Ted Ensslin, Theodore Ensslin.
Right. Okay.
And a really great bibliographer by the name of Robert Bertolf. He was a longtime director of the University of Buffalo libraries, and he died last year. And anyway, he asked me to do it, and I thought it was going to be more of a collaboration, frankly. But at this point, anyway, I'm going to try to do that. Enslin's an important poet. He was sort of heavily collected in the 70s, but people have sort of forgotten about him, and he was a bit of a hermit. And he was sort of the bane of collectors because he had around about 140 A items, and so, and many mostly very small presses. So anyway, so it's hopefully for the few people who really care now, it'll be important, and maybe someday it'll be of use to some graduate students somewhere. So but we'll see.
Lindsay, don't let me hog the conversation.
Oh no, it just strikes me that one nice thing about dealing in poetry is that a buyer and a seller meet, you've got a steady customer simply because there are people who like particular poets, or once they learn about them, they want to acquire more. And so it almost is a self-propagating specialty for collectors.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it's actually sort of answer your question before about why poetry. And I do think that, I think any good antiquarian bookseller has regular customers and certainly knows their the diverse needs of different customers. But with poetry, you really do rely on some buyers who are well, frankly, usually more knowledgeable about the subject than you are, because it's their real passion. And so being a poetry specialist, I do have some really good, really interesting people that read my catalogs and check my website occasionally, and usually have some interesting conversations. As I mentioned to Lindsay earlier, I really, in many cases, I have no idea what they look like. I may know the dog's name and the wife's name, but I have no idea what they even look like. It's all email or phone,
Yeah.
Within the universe of poetry, do you deal in any particular subsets, like American poets versus international, or national versus regional?
No, in some ways, the reason I got into this book business is sort of a way of learning and learning more about literature. And, I did end up spending more time on poetry than I ever thought I would, but but I've learned about poets that, even though I was reasonably well-versed, I mean, I went to graduate school in English, and, but even very knowledgeable poets very often have some huge gaps in their knowledge of 20th century poetry or 19th century poetry. So it's been a real learning experience. I've learned about a lot of poets, and I do think of it really as sort of a long graduate course in a way in poetry.
Well, one of the attractions I find in it, and I came across it when I started in college at St. Andrews down in Laurinburg, which had and still does have a very active program of visiting poets, is it's one of the few fields left in book publishing where you get really quality editions and constantly see things from authors you'd never hear about. It's almost like what I imagine the 18th century was like, when there was somebody in every other village who had a printing press.
Yeah.
The vicar could write his poems down and have a published edition.
That's true.
It might actually turn out to be good.
It is becoming a problem, though, for collectors, in that a lot is online. A lot of poetry today is being published in paper only, no hardcover editions, and libraries didn't used to like that, but they've become accommodated to having to have paper. I even had I won't mention the university press, but one of the great university presses, I happen to have a hardcover. It's beautiful. It doesn't have a jacket, but it's a beautifully bound book. But the paperback is, it looks like a print on demand that you might get out of some machine at a cafe espresso machine out of your local bookstore. And but at least it had a cover, an illustrated cover, but it looked like it was rather amateurishly done. So for collectors, if you care about how a book looks, sometimes paperbacks can sort of turn people off. But there are some great presses. Actually, the Pulitzer Prize went to a poet I had never heard of before. I'm embarrassed to say. He's had a couple of books out, but his press is called Wave Press, and they do wonderful things and really beautifully bound books, really high quality books. So in my field, the presses are pretty important.
Of course, even at the low end, you get people who like chapbooks and fugitive materials, and so even in the 70s, when I was in college, one of the hot things was mimeographed and stapled sometimes.
Well, for the last decade, that's been a huge collectible market. Probably some of the good serious collectors have been really focused on that for probably 20 years now. But there's some great collections and institutions of mimeograph material. I like it.
And because it's so ephemeral, it's harder to come by, isn't it?
It is. Well, and they were done, when mimeographs were, very, I think 500 was a max, but you rarely ever would run off 500. It just took so much time, and too many things would go wrong with the pages. And then you have to staple it, and all of that, and the staples come out, and staples rust and everything else. So 100 is a pretty good run for a mimeograph. I do a lot in chapbooks. I bought some pretty good chapbook collections, and they're difficult to deal with because they're small, and for the most part, you can't ask very much money for them, and it takes a long time to catalog a single page folded 4 times than it does a Chaucer, But I do enjoy that, and they're sort of easy to store. I bring them along in little boxes, actually. So.
One of the things I always, this is totally inappropriate, but one of the things I always enjoyed about mimeograph was the smell of the ink.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing that doesn't last. The mimeograph. And only in our memories, but I think most people who might be watching this wouldn't have any idea what a mimeograph machine is. But
well, good point there. That's for sure.
Actually, the best thing I'll be bringing to the Florida Book Fair is a mimeographed item. Actually, so.
And more respectable than hanging around gas pumps.
I suppose so. Mark, what other things are you planning to bring to the book fair? What do you have anything handy that you can show us that you're going to bring?
Well, I can show you. I'll show you this one. I'll take it off the wall.
Okay.
So excuse the delay, but this is a. How's that showing up?
Turn it with the top toward us a little bit. The top aimed toward us.
Good.
That's better. That's better.
So this is
even a little more. Yes. Okay.
So this is only the title page and the dedication page.
Gary Snyder. Oh my God.
If you notice, but if you see the signatures on here, it's Allen Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti. This is Philomanthe, Gary Snyder, Philip Whalen, and also Martha Rexroth.
Wow!
Wow! Those were the 6. The first reading of HOWL was at a. I'll set this down. The first reading of HOWL was at a place called the Sixth Gallery. Right. It was advertised. It was advertised as 6 poets at Sixth Gallery, and it's a. There weren't many people there, but Jack Kerouac was there, and he famously wrote about it, I believe, in Big Sur, where he was drunk, causing a bit of a commotion. But Gary Snyder actually read last and was really thought to have done a wonderful job. Michael McClure, who happens to be on the back of this panel, I can show it to you later. Michael McClure actually wrote a really long essay on the back of the title page, and but it was the very first reading that he ever did. The writing that Martha Rexroth does is about the fact that she ran off the mimeograph at San Francisco State, which is where Kenneth Rexroth taught. So the first edition of HOWL was actually only 25 copies, and it was done the following year, just prior to the City Lights edition, and of course Ferlinghetti, who signed this, was at the event, and he famously repeated Emerson's note to Whitman that he greeted him on a great career and asked to publish the book. So what I showed you here is actually, it's the first edition, but it was actually a second issue, and most people don't know about it. But the second issue was actually run off in the 80s by a Gotham Book Mart. They were going to do a limited edition. Allen Ginsberg objected to that, so anyway, so they really weren't supposed to reach the market. but there are some copies out there of full copies. They go for an astronomical amount of money. But both the first and second issues, which are the only ones out there, the Stanford actually has the original, the mimeograph is there. But anyway, but this is the only one I know of that's framed. But unfortunately, there's only the title page and the dedication page. But it's on the other hand, it's signed by the people who read it. That Memento is really one of the great events of the 20th century in terms of poetry.
Oh, sure. Wow, that's quite an item to bring.
Well, yeah, it does attract some attention so
especially in our town with the Kerouac connection. That of course probably it would be somewhat popular in San Francisco as well. I'm guessing.
That's where it originally came from. Yes, it was actually originally owned by Peter Howard. Is actually of Serendipity Bookshop in Berkeley. Is the one who actually put this whole thing together. Got the signatures on it. That was back in about a little over a decade ago, a couple decades ago, actually. At this point.
Well, that's remarkable. So what else do you have, or do you have anything else handy that?
Well, I'll bring out a Frost. I should have put these in a pile. But I can grab it right here. This is one of the best books I have, and this is Robert Frost's first book. The Frost's first two books were done in a total of 1,000.
Hold it closer.
Copies.
Yeah, there you go. That's nice. Very nice.
And I can't do much more than show you this, but the first edition there were only 350 copies printed of the first edition. The others, there were a total of 6. It was true of both North of Boston and Boy's Will. There are 1,000 sheets printed, but as was the custom of that time and earlier times too, the books tended to only bind what you would need. And so this is actually, I can't really show you any more than this because it's never been opened. The leaves have never been cut. And so it's hard to show anything more than that, but it's that lovely double, and it really is almost like it's brand new, and it was printed in 1913.
Wow.
So I'm pretty proud of that. And I will be bringing that to the book fair. I'll probably bring quite a lot of Frost. I do also have the North of Boston, which is in a green binding, which is the first. And I have a couple of, also they have the first North of Boston that was published in the United States. It actually used the British sheets, and Holt, when they decided to publish Frost, they had 150 copies bound. And as again was the custom of the times, it sort of ended around that period of time, but there were tremendous problems with copyright issues. And so they had to, having the fact that it was printed in Great Britain meant that it still didn't necessarily satisfy the copyright laws. So they had to go ahead and print an American edition after that. But this is the one of the 150 was actually the first Frost published in the United States. The other two books, the Boy's Will, were in North of Boston, were originally published in Great Britain. A lot of people don't realize how Frost was well into his 30s before he was ever even published. So, and then not even in the United States.
So what else? Anything else you got?
Well, I just did a catalog, and this is my most recent catalog, and which has only been out about a little over a week. I also I do it electronically, so I'll be bringing some books from that. I have a signed W.H. Auden the last book published while he was still alive. So it's pretty rare because Epistle to a Godson. It's quite rare because he spent most of his time in Europe, and the book being published here, he didn't really spend much time in the United States. I also have some posters that from the mid '70s that were done for poetry readings at Cody's Bookshop and other places in San Francisco. I have a few of those. I have Anne Carson's first book, which was she's a really important Canadian poet, and her first book was actually published with three other, as has happened with a lot of people. The first book was actually published with three other poets as sort of in one volume, and I have a really pristine copy of her book. I have. I don't do this very often. You asked me before if I did much in terms of international poetry, and I tend not to, but I do have a St. John's Paris Wins, which was done in the United States in 1953, but he won the Nobel Prize in 1960 for poetry. And he was a man who was a diplomat. He really spent most of his life as a diplomat, and he didn't believe that one should, if you were going to be a diplomat, you ought to work hard at it. And so he didn't really publish any poetry, but he was quite famous, early modernist, and T.S. Eliot actually translated him in the 1920s. So this was one of the first books. He happened to be living in the United States because of after the war, he couldn't live in France. And anyway, so this was one of the first books here, and it has to be signed.
Did he know Eliot?
Well, Eliot certainly knew him. I'm sure he knew Eliot. My guess is that I have to be careful about how I say this. I think both Eliot and Stevens have been accused of stealing from the French. I'm not sure that the French have ever been accused from stealing from Stevens or Eliot. So yeah, no, I think Eliot read quite widely in French literature, and particularly at that time, the modernists really began both in art and in poetry, and really with the French. And so Eliot was, I'm sure, quite aware of. I'm not sure that the French were all that aware of going on in England. Maybe with James Joyce, possibly. But
well, a lot of those guys were right in their neighborhood.
That's correct, and it was yes, that's correct. And France was an inexpensive place to live, so they did spend a lot of time over there in the 1920s.
I suspect that the French literary scene was probably didn't pay a whole lot of attention to those guys. There were a bunch of young whippersnappers who were running away from their own country.
Right, and well, a lot of them, particularly Ford Max Ford and Hilda Doolittle, those people, they lived quite a sort of bohemian lives, and they did spend a lot of time traveling the continent. Some of them had quite a lot of money and spent a lot of time traveling. Of course, when Frost went over to England in 1913, 1912, actually 1911, he went to see Yeats, and who was still very productive at that point in 1911. So Yeats was sort of where the literary world revolved at that time, and it was just beginning to change. Pound was there, a young man, making his way, but he still had to genuflect to Yeats at that point. But
sure. Well, Mark, this has been very fascinating, and
you can see how those circles do and don't intersect, sometimes in very small spaces. And one case that has always surprised me, and I keep dogging it to see what I can find, is how Gertrude Stein and Edith Wharton managed to live in Paris for 30 years and never met each other.
Yeah, it was two very different kind of women, I think. Yes.
But
That's
think of
interesting.
the collisions there would have been had they met.
Well, the one I always loved, one of my favorite, the name hasn't come up, but my favorite writer really is Vladimir Nabokov. And they do believe that he and Joyce were actually in the same room together. And people forget that, and probably did meet, but nobody can be 100% sure. But they do know that they were at a party together. And Nabokov was really the most famous Russian young writer of his time. And Joyce was a much more famous person at that point. So it's a good chance, and Nabokov really did respect Joyce. So it's a good chance that they actually shook hands and maybe had a conversation. It would make a wonderful, maybe short, but a wonderful little movie. But there's a lot of people would love to know what they did talk about, if they did in fact.
That has a lot of possibilities for it, doesn't it?
It did. Well, people forget Nabokov was actually born in 1899, so he wasn't that much. He was only like a couple years older than Fitzgerald. He was 2 years older than Fitzgerald. I think a year older than Hemingway, and he had his career lasted much longer. But he was anyway, very much in that generation. So,
Lindsay, any closing questions or comments?
Well, this has been great fun for me personally, as a poetry aficionado, to sit for half an hour, and I'm all the more envious of those who will be at the book fair and be able to see the things that Mark's going to be bringing. So thank you for taking this time to visit with us.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation, and I hope to meet you both in person one of these days.
Yes, indeed. Well, as you, in your earlier conversation, you may have learned that Lindsay will be our anchor man he'll be in the studio anchoring the program while we run around crazy on the book fair floor and talk to various dealers who are there. And we'll certainly want to stop by your booth and hopefully at a time when you're not just swamped with people.
I hope I'm swamped. It would be an unusual situation. It has happened, but not very often.
I was telling him earlier about my dream of a book fair drone, and he looked more than a little alarmed at the prospect of aerial devices crashing into his booth.
Well, that probably is the one reason I haven't pursued it. The other is not at this point being able to afford a drone, but that has crossed my mind that it would be great to have a drone fly out over the book fair floor and really take in the whole scene. The danger, of course, is exactly that we don't want a drone falling from the sky, and we certainly don't want any of the infamous drones. So we'll probably refrain from that.
Well, I sort of look forward to a drone here one of these days. Not this fair, the next one maybe, but.
So Mark, thank you so much for being with us. We will see you at the book fair, and we'll look forward to seeing more once you are set up there. We'll look forward to seeing more of the things you've brought. But I suspect that your piece from HOWL is going to generate a lot of attention.
Well, I hope so. Well, thanks for letting me show it. I appreciate it, and good talking to you.
All right, we will be on. I will be on tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. with another update. We may have some more before that, but when we do, you'll see it right here on Facebook, and possibly over on the YouTube on the Hangouts on YouTube. So thanks for being with us, and we'll see you at the book fair.
All right. You all have a good evening.